Welcome back. In the previous 3 videos, we've talked through how the Core Knowledge Middle School math curriculum works, become familiar with all those files that are available to download from Core Knowledge, and taken a detailed tour of the teacher's guide and the assessments. Now, if you haven't watched those first 3 videos yet, please do that first, and then come back here and join me. You'll just be in a better position to understand how the lessons flow if you're familiar with the curriculum. All right, in this video, we're going to do a detailed walkthrough of an example lesson. The lessons in the teacher's guide for this curriculum are very detailed, and they can be overwhelming when you first read through them. Now, I have extensive experience at this point, preparing resources to use with the Core Knowledge curriculum, as well as using Core Knowledge curriculum to homeschool my own kids. And even I sometimes get overwhelmed when I first dive into a newly released curriculum. So my goal in this video is to take that stressful feeling of being overwhelmed away, or at least greatly reduce it. I've spent many hours going over all these resources. So grab a coffee or a tea and let's do this part together. We're going to look carefully at a full math lesson. Now, for example, I'm going to be using a lesson from one of the units for 6th grade. However, the entire middle school math curriculum is laid out in the same general manner. So even if you plan on using the 7th or 8th grade curriculum, the information in this video should still apply. Now, as we work through this lesson together, I'm going to attempt to enlarge portions of the page on the slide. But as a practical matter, unless you're watching this on a really large screen, you probably won't be able to read what I'm showing you. I just can't make it quite that big. I'd like you to get as much out of this video as possible, though, so here's my recommendation. Pause the video, go over to the Core Knowledge website, click on the free curriculum option, and then use those filters on the left-hand side of the screen to select 6th grade math. Download Unit 4. It's free, right? You can download as many of these as you want. Download Unit 4, which is the dividing fractions unit, and we're going to be looking at the first lesson in that unit. So if you can download those files and open the teacher's guide and the student book in particular, you'll have a much easier time following along with this video. Now, this lesson does include a cool down worksheet and a black line master. Those are also files in that folder you'll have downloaded, and ideally, if you could open those as well, that would be great. And hopefully you know where those are when we talked about in video number 2. Now, I'm not going to read the lesson to you, don't worry, but I would really encourage you as we work through these sections and I'm summarizing what's there, please feel free to pause the video often and read carefully through the section we're discussing. Now, a quick note, this is going to be the longest video by far for this 4-video series. In fact, it might take me longer to walk you through this than it might take you to teach your students. So please don't panic. I just want to be sure that you can walk away from this video with all the mystery removed from this whole situation so you can confidently use this curriculum. Now, before we dive in, I want to take a moment to review the 4 files we're going to be using in this lesson, and you'll use 3 of them for every lesson you teach with this curriculum. So we went through this info in video number 2, but let's just remind ourselves of what those are and quickly review how you'll have prepared to use these files before you ever sit down to teach a lesson. First, we're going to use the teacher's guide, right? That's where all the important lesson information resides. And while you can print a copy of it, doing so isn't necessary. I would recommend just using a tablet or a laptop to access the file. Okay, here's my pro tip. If you're planning on purchasing a laptop to use this school year, get the biggest one within your budget. Once you get to about that 10-inch range, you can not only have a full page of the teacher's guide on the screen at once, but the text is actually a readable size, even for those of us who might be getting a little older and have failing eyesight. Okay, so once I got like a 10-inch laptop, this whole thing got so much easier because I could have that whole page on the screen. But certainly not a requirement, just if you happen to be buying one anyway, that's something you might want to keep in mind. All right, next, we're going to be using the student book, which is where the worksheets are at. And remember from video number 2, as well as the organization guide you can download from my website, you'll have printed that workbook and had it either spiral bound at your local office supply store, or you'll have 3-hole punched it and placed it in a binder. Now, in video number 2, we talked about how you can print this workbook in black and white if you need to. It's more affordable for sure. However, keep in mind that there are going to be some figures that will be in color. I think some of them are in this lesson, and it'll be harder to decipher those in black and white. Now, if you can print in color, do that, but really don't stress about this. When you run into the figures where you need to see the color, you can just access the page of the PDF file on a tablet or laptop for your student to reference during the lesson. So color is not necessary for the printing portion. All right, next, the cool down sheets. One of these sheets is used at the end of almost every lesson. And as we talked about before, for some reason, these are in a separate file from the student book. We're going to fix that, right? We're going to organize these resources in a way that makes it as easy as possible for us to homeschool every day. So like I mentioned in video number 2, I recommend printing this file and binding it with the student workbook or placing it in the same binder. It'll just be so much easier to have those cool down sheets with the worksheets. All right, and finally, this lesson uses a black line master. And again, that's a separate file you'll have printed in advance. And as a reminder, the first page of the file is a chart letting you know how many copies to print and whether you should use regular paper or cardstock. And I strongly recommend printing these at the beginning of the school year, or at least at the beginning of the unit, and just placing them in a folder you keep close by. Now, I'm just trying to get you set up here, okay? It's because I want you to be able to follow along with this video and feel comfortable taking in the information. Once you start teaching lessons to your student, you'll have already prepped all this stuff, right? All the worksheets and the cool down pages. And then the teacher's guide is really going to let you know what extra things like black line masters and supplies you'll need each day. There's no mystery here. That information will be available to you every school day. So let's start by looking at this first page and a half for the lesson. This is the overview of the lesson, and I do recommend that for maybe the first few weeks, you try to take some time to read this carefully. I'm not talking about a lot of time. It'll probably take you about 5 minutes. And don't worry, you can completely skip some of these sections. I'm going to show you which ones in just a moment. And as you get more comfortable with the curriculum, you can probably get to a point where you're just kind of scanning this information right before you teach it. Okay, so let's go through each section in detail so you're clear on what each one is and which ones you don't need. All right, so I have blown up a section of the page of the teacher's guide here. This is just to orient you, this is lesson 1, and it's part of a set of lessons or a section that focuses on the size of the divisor and the size of the quotient. So right up front, we have the goals and learning targets for this lesson. And I have to say, I do really like that these are available. It's really easy sometimes when we're teaching to lose the overarching thread, maybe get a little too caught up in the details. Now, most likely, if you teach what's laid out for you, you're going to reach these goals. But I do think it's helpful sometimes, especially if you're new to homeschooling, to use these goals and learning targets to kind of double check yourself at the end of the lesson. Make sure your student understood and retained this specific information. Most of these goals are going to be things like the student comprehending certain concepts or being able to explain back to you how to work through a process. For the learning target on this one, it says, when dividing, I know the size of a divisor affects the quotient. So that's a really good example of verifying that your student is walking away with that deeper understanding of how the numbers relate to each other versus just being able to work through the steps to do the division. The steps are important, but so is understanding why and how it works. All right, next up is the lesson narrative. This is a useful section to read through, and thankfully it is short. It's going to lay out for you how this lesson fits into the broader learning for a set of lessons and the whole unit. Again, really orienting us to where we are in the process of our student achieving understanding of this topic. And yes, if you're very good at math yourself or you've been doing this for a long time, you may end up reading this information less thoroughly. All right, next, we have the alignment section and the instructional routines. These you can skip. Okay, so these are really there for the benefit of a classroom teacher. The alignment portion is helping teachers meet their statutory requirements for alignment with state standards. Something, thankfully, homeschoolers don't typically need to worry about. And then the instructional routines is alerting the teacher to the types of classroom processes. Okay, so a quick note here, hang with me. Some of you, in fact, a rapidly growing number of you, are here right now because you've pulled your kids out of public school, but you have every intention of re-enrolling them at some point. So first, welcome. If that's your situation, you may have been wondering how well this curriculum will keep your students on track, right, with their public school peers. And that's a really fair question. Because the Core Knowledge Foundation is focused on improving the quality of the U.S. public school education, and they are working to have their curriculum adopted by districts, which would be amazing, this curriculum is set up to align to the Common Core standards. And a quick reminder that Common Core is a very long and complicated list of concepts to be learned by grade level. It is not, in fact, itself a curriculum. It's a really common misconception. It's just a list of standards. All right, rest assured, if you follow this curriculum, your student's going to be on track to re-enter the U.S. public school system based on the stated concepts to be learned by grade level. And actually, really, your student is probably going to be in a much better position with a deeper understanding and advanced knowledge, because Common Core is a minimum standard core knowledge uses when they're designing their curriculum. This is actually a much higher quality curriculum than what schools typically use. All right, moving on, we have required materials and required preparation. You will want to pay special attention to this. If you're using the unit-specific prep checklist from my website, then this info is laid out there as well, and it's in a list format, so you can kind of see everything for a lesson in the unit at once. Now, here's a pro tip. A lot of the required prep in this curriculum, where you see required preparation there, a lot of that is just cutting out shapes or cards from those black line masters. And I am sure in a classroom with 30 kids, that's a really good idea to do that in advance. I could see how that would make your day easier. But really, we only have one student. So just you can just have your child cut this out while you're talking to them or something. You don't necessarily need to do the advanced prep. All right, now you heard me mention in earlier videos that one of the strengths of this program is that there are some really cool real-world demonstrations. A lot of them look like something you'd see in a good science class. And when you come across those lessons, this is where the supplies will be listed, as well, of course, as being listed on that unit-specific prep checklist you downloaded, hopefully from my website. All right, finally, in this intro section, there's that short student learning goals section. This one, for example, says, let's explore quotients of different sizes. This is simply meant to give students an idea of the goal for the day. Some of you may find it helpful to write this statement up on a whiteboard or a chalkboard as like a focal point for the lesson. If you use core knowledge subjects, like if you use their language arts or their history and geography or science curriculums, you'll have seen this idea before. There's always a big question or goal for a lesson to kind of orient everyone to the task at hand. All right. So that's it for the intro section. Next up, let's look at the lesson script itself. Okay, so just to orient us to where we're at here and how this is going to work, each lesson has 6 distinct parts, and they are conveniently broken out the same way for almost every lesson. Sometimes those project lessons that are the last lesson in the unit are structured differently, for example, but let's just do a quick overview of what the average lesson looks like before we dive in and look carefully at each section. All right, section 1.1 is the warm-up and likely will last about 5 minutes. Section 1.2 is the primary lesson. This is where you'll be explicitly instructing your student on materials for this lesson. It's in a one-on-one setting, like in a homeschool setting. I'd anticipate this section might take you about 10 minutes to complete. Section 1.3 is focused on the student practicing applying what they've learned. Now, it's important to keep in mind that this portion still involves explicit instruction. You'll be sitting right there with them and helping them work through some initial practice problems, and this section will likely take about 10 to 15 minutes to complete, depending on your individual student. Section 1.4 is the cool down. You'll be using that separate cool down worksheet, and when we get there, I'll show you that. These are meant to be about 5 minutes to wrap up the lesson and synthesize what was learned with some quick practice. All right, the next part, what I refer to as part number 5, is the independent practice for the student. So with the teaching portion done, you'll be giving your student the practice pages from the student book, and they'll work through those. And I want to point out that some kids will be able to do this independently. Some won't, right? So you may need to plan to be nearby during that portion. Especially for 6th and 7th grade, it's really going to depend on your kids, your individual child's math proficiency and general maturity. But for most kids, I'd anticipate this independent practice should take 15 to 25 minutes each day. And finally, the last thing you'll be doing is reviewing their work and having the student correct any errors. Those answers for the student practice pages with explanations for any particularly challenging problems are found at the end of each lesson in the teacher's guide. Okay, so just to quickly summarize, you're probably looking at 50 to 60 minutes of math each day. And keep in mind, that's inclusive. You're not going to be assigning additional homework. So for the same amount of time a typical middle schooler would spend in math class each day, your student will complete both the class material and the homework. Okay, so let's dive in and go through each of these sections in details. But a quick reminder here to avoid confusion as I'm going through this. This curriculum was written for a classroom, including a teacher standing up in front and showing large versions of problems on the student worksheets and groups of students being able to work together on problems. In a homeschool setting, neither of those things is likely to be part of our setup, right? So as we go through this, I'm going to talk you through examples of how you would adjust an activity. And don't worry, you'll do this a few times with lessons, and then you'll be adjusting activities without even thinking about it. So if you're following along using the PDF files for this lesson, we are on the sixth grade, Unit 4, Teacher's Guide, page 10. And you'll want to turn to page 1 in the student book since your student would have that open for the lesson as well. Now, before we go any further, I want to be really clear about how the teacher's guide and student book correspond. I'm hoping you have that student book file open, and if you do, go ahead and flip through the lesson, the lesson 1 pages. That's pages 1 through 6. You'll see that each section is numbered 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and then cumulative practice problems. Now, as we work through the lesson, those section numbers in the teacher's guide will correspond with the student book. So when we're working on section 1.1 in the teacher's guide, which is a warm-up, your student will be using that top part of the page of their workbook page marked 1.1. On the screen here, you see a section of the page from the teacher's guide on the left, and then the page from the student book on the right. And then when we move to section 1.2 in the teacher's guide, your student will move to the 1.2 portion of their work page. All right, so keeping track of where your student needs to be in their worksheet is really easy. This is an incredibly well-organized curriculum, thankfully. All right, so that first section there, right under the words warm-up 5 minutes. This section is explaining to you as the teacher what the goal is for this activity. And in this case, the short version is that the student will have an opportunity to understand how the dividend and divisor relate to each other and how the values of those numbers affect the size of the quotient. And this activity is going to focus on mentally evaluating some expressions. Now, right under that, you'll see those building on and instructional routines sections. Again, these are the same deal we saw in the introduction. They're related to teachers needing to meet standards and alerting them to classroom procedures. As a homeschooler, you get to ignore these. All right, so let's move on down to that launch section. This is the specific instructions you're going to give your student for the activity. Now, it mentions here revealing one problem at a time. That's more of an instruction for a teacher up in front of a classroom with a projector. They just show one problem at a time and cover everything else up with a piece of paper. In your case, if you think seeing all the problems at once is going to distract your student, you just take a piece of paper and you put it over the problems you're not working on. It's easy. All right, so flipping to the next page, that's page 11 in the teacher's guide. This next section is a quick call out with help for the teacher who is supporting students with disabilities. Now, if this applies in your situation, definitely take a look at that information when you encounter it in a lesson. Next, you'll see a section addressing common misconceptions. This is one of those things I think is so valuable with this curriculum. It's really approaching the teacher's guide from a perspective that a teacher themselves may need some help teaching the subject. So right up front, they're letting you know what the common issues are with that you might see with your student grasping these concepts, so you can be on a lookout for them and quickly correct them. All right, next there on page 11, you'll see the student task statement. This is code. This is a special code, I guess. For here is the task the student is supposed to do. And now, if you look over the student worksheet for 1.1, you'll see this information is duplicated. So student task statement is just a fancy way of saying this is what the student's going to work on. And then right below that, you'll see the answers for those expressions, including possible reasoning the student might use to mentally reach an answer. And for clarity, on the right-hand side is the student's book work page. And then on the right-hand side of this slide is the teacher's guide. All right, next up, you'll see at the bottom of that teacher's guide section is activity synthesis. As it implies, the goal here is to synthesize what was just experienced or learned in the warm-up. Now, this section very much assumes you're in a classroom setting. So let's go through one as an example briefly and talk about what this would look like in a homeschooling setting. Okay, first, it suggests inviting a few students to share how they solve the problems. Instead, you'll take a moment to talk to your student about how they solve the problems. All right, so you are their group member. There are even some helpful questions here to ask your students, such as, why is the value of the expression getting smaller each time? All right, so turning next to page 12, we're continuing this section, right? The synthesizing section. So right there at the top, it's giving you a few explanations to highlight that support two ways to think about division. And again, this is just talking to your student, discussing the concept to ensure that they are understanding. Now, right below that, there are even more examples of questions you could ask your student to help move them along in their understanding of this concept. And then right there in the middle of the page is a call-out section for support for English language learners or ELL students. Again, if this applies to your specific situation, please take a look at that info when it appears in the lessons, as it can be really helpful. All right, let's move on to the next section of the lesson. We're still on page 12 here. This is the section marked 1.2, which is titled All Stacked Up, and it's the primary lesson portion. Again, right there at the top, there's an explanation to you as the teacher of the goals for this portion of the lesson. And you'll want to briefly read the beginning where it starts, this lesson aims, all the way down until you hit that building on section on the next page. Again, this will take about a minute to read and explains that students will be estimating height and talking about thickness versus height. And you'll see right off that this is structured as a group activity. So in a classroom, a group of students will work together. In your case, you are your student's group member, so you'll be working alongside them, asking helpful questions and participating while letting them come to their own conclusions as often as possible. You know, it takes some practice, but I promise you're going to get the hang of this pretty quickly. And again, as we move further into the section, you can skip the alignment and instructional routines information. And so next up is that launch section, along with the anticipated misconceptions and that student task statement. So this looks just like 1.1, right? 1.2's layout is a lot like 1.1. You'll use this info to explain the task to your student and watch out for any common misconceptions. You'll notice too that this activity in both the teacher's guide and student book involves 3 questions to work through and extends to the following page as well. All right, so just to orient ourselves, the 2 pages on the left are the student workbook pages, and I've circled the 1.2 portions of the page on the right. And then on the right is the teacher's guide. So first up, they'll be estimating how many items would be in a stack 5 feet tall. And then you'll see on page 14 of the teacher's guide, there's some examples of student responses and possible reasoning that could be used. And then they move on to question 2 and 3 and use the answers in the teacher, and then you'd use the answers in the teacher's guide to verify the student answered correctly. Now, if you have those files open, you'll see that the teacher's guide contains the exact same problems as the student worksheet, but includes the answers and explanations under the student response section. All right, finally, you'll have that activity synthesis, which will guide you through talking to your student about how they reached their estimate. All right. This is on page 15 of the teacher's guide. This is the last portion of section 1.2. And while, again, here the teacher's guide assumes you are working with a group of students, you would just use these questions to prompt a discussion with your one student. Okay, now you'll notice, though, at no point are you expected to come up with activity instructions, discussion, questions, etc. All that is laid out for you. So this is really handy if you haven't taught math before, and especially if you're nervous about teaching math. The teacher's guide really is holding your hand here. All right, next up, section 1.3, which is page 15 in the teacher's guide and page 2 in the student book. So this portion of the lesson is typically focused on continuing the learning process through examples and practicing concepts. Again, this section is set up just like the last 2. It starts with an introduction, laying out what you'll be doing. This is a sorting activity, so students can continue to explore the relationships between dividends, divisors, and quotients. Moving on to page 16 of the teacher's guide, you'll skip the alignment info and move on to the launch section, which will guide you through explaining the activity to your student. Now, again, this activity assumes students will be working in groups, so instead, you and your student will work together. This activity calls for using a black line master for the lesson, and I've put copies of it there on the left. So as a reminder, those black line master file is in the teacher's resources folder that was included with all those unit files you downloaded from Core Knowledge. Ideally, you'll have printed all the black line masters out at the beginning of the unit, and you'll have this handy for when you teach this lesson. For this lesson, the black line master is 2 pages. That's pretty unusual. Usually it's 1. This one is 2 pages. Here they are. And you and your student could just cut those into little cards to use for the activity. All right, moving on to page 17. Again, there's a section addressing anticipated misconceptions. And once you've read through that, you'll work with your student on the activity. And again, you'll notice that the instructions and problems listed in the teacher's guide are duplicates of what the student has in front of them in their student book. Now, when you reach the end of that first section of problems in 1.3 and you've checked the student's answers against the response in the teacher's guide, here on page 18, you'll see there is a second section, a sort of challenge question for the student to work through with you as well. And then again, you'll see that activity synthesis listed in the teacher's guide with suggestions for specific questions that you can use to help your student reason through what they've learned, because that's a really important part of the learning process. All right, the next part of the lesson, synthesis section, and that starts on the bottom of page 18 and continues on to page 19. So this is pretty much a script of what to say to your student to help them synthesize what was learned, including helping them recall what they observed and reviewing what was learned. And I feel like I'm saying this word synthesize a lot, but seriously, this emphasis in the teacher's guide on carefully wrapping up each section by talking through what was learned is such a benefit to students with how our human brains learn. All right, 3 sections down, 1 to go in terms of the teaching portion. So we've done sections 1, 2, and 3. That takes us to section 1.4, which is page 19 in the teacher's guide. And we will be using the cool down sheet, which you see here on the right. Now, quick reminder, the cool down sheets are located, unfortunately, in a separate file in the teacher resources folder that was included in the files you downloaded from Core Knowledge. And I'd encourage you to print those at the beginning of the year, the beginning of the unit, put them in with the student workbook pages, because honestly, that is where they belong. Okay, so for this section, your student will turn to the lesson 1 cool down page and work through the problems listed. And the goal here again is to really bring together the concepts and directly apply and practice what was learned. And this will take maybe 5 minutes, so it's pretty quick, and the answers are right there in the teacher's guide. All right, once that's done, both the teacher's guide and student book have a student lesson summary, which just summarizes what was learned with specific examples. This info is from the teacher's guide, but the exact same info appears on page 3 of the student book. If your student has struggled a bit with the concept, you can use this. It's a great way to review the teaching one more time. If your student sailed through the lesson, you could probably skip this. Just, use your best judgment. Okay, so that ends the formal teaching portion of the lesson. As I mentioned earlier, all this will typically take 25 to 30 minutes to work through, but it's going to depend a little bit on your specific student. And don't panic if it takes you longer at first. Part of doing this efficiently and teaching every day is going to come from familiarity and practice. There's a real rhythm to these lessons, and with time, you're going to get more efficient with your teaching. All right. So the teaching portion with the teaching portion done, now comes the independent practice. So ideally, your student will work through the lesson 1 practice problems independently. If you're following along in that student book PDF file, that's page 4 in the student book, and I have that here on the left. On the right is the corresponding page in the teacher's guide, which is page 21. And you'll see there that the teacher's guide contains both the questions and answers as well as any explanations. Okay, so for the most part, these practice pages are self-explanatory. Your student will work through the problems and then you'll go over them so your student can correct any mistakes. Now, this particular lesson doesn't contain any complicated practice problems, but as you work through the curriculum, there'll be times when a more thorough explanation of a solution to a problem is called for. And one of the things that's impressed me with this curriculum is that when needed, there are detailed written explanations to solutions. It's just not, here's how to do the problem, it's here's why you do the problem. And with those complicated problems, when they show up, it really helps you as a teacher guide your student. There is significantly more explanation, help, and just general hand-holding here for the teacher than you normally see in a math curriculum. All right, so let's take a few minutes here so I can point out some things about this portion of the lesson where your student is working independently. Okay, first, this is just a feature. These worksheets have more white space than I think I've seen in any other math curriculum commonly used by homeschoolers. This is going to be really helpful to the growing number of kids who are easily overwhelmed by a lot of problems on a single page. Okay, next, as we sort of just talked about, the problems listed in the student book are duplicated in the teacher's guide, and those answers are right there in the teacher's guide below the problem. You don't need to open any separate files or go to a different part of the teacher's guide to find the solutions. Next, there aren't a lot of problems for the independent practice. This lesson, for example, has 7 problems for the independent portion, although some of the problems do have multiple parts. Since you've worked through a decent number of practice problems during the teaching portion of the lesson, this independent part is shorter than you see in a lot of math curriculums. I do think this is sufficient practice for most kids. But if you have a child who needs more practice, that's okay. You may just need to supplement with a secondary math workbook, and I'll try to do a blog post sometime soon and put together a list of the sorts of options that are out there for just getting like an extra different workbook for them to practice with. That's more of a general homeschooling problem, though, honestly, than curriculum specific. Some kids just need lots of practice, and those kids typically need some sort of supplemental resource. All right, finally, about half these practice problems are specifically practicing the skills learned in this lesson or subset of lessons. And then about half the problems are review from previous lessons and previous units. If you're following along with the PDF file of the student book, you'll see for this lesson, starting with question 4, there are review problems. And helpfully, you'll see in small font underneath the problems in parentheses, there is a reference to where the skill needed to solve the problem was taught. Okay, so it's really tiny print, so I circled these. So in the case with question 5, at the bottom of page 5, the skills to solve that question, the skills that are being reviewed there were taught in Unit 3, Lesson 15. So there's a note there. So that's really handy to refer back to as needed. All right, so once your student has corrected any errors they've made in the practice problems, you're finished with that lesson. So cue the major sense of accomplishment. All right, you did it. All 4 videos. I know it was a lot. Okay. So next steps. If you haven't done so already, you'll want to download the free curriculum from the Core Knowledge website. When you get to their website, just click on that download free curriculum button up at the top. I also, on my YouTube channel and on my website, I have a video on exactly how to download stuff from Core Knowledge if you need that. All right, then be sure to download all the free resources from my website. I have a daily schedule, an organization guide with all that info on what to print and how to get everything ready. I also have a unit-specific prep checklist. So before you start each unit, you'll have an easy list of what supplies you're going to need, what needs to be printed, that sort of thing. Please also check out my other resources on my website as well as my YouTube channel. If you can, subscribe to my YouTube channel so you get all the new videos. My goal is to make the high quality and free Core Knowledge curriculum easy to use for homeschoolers. And I have resources there for both elementary school and middle school. All right, so that's it for now. Best wishes on your homeschooling journey.